Welcome to Nightmare Narratives. Tonight, we're taking you on a journey into the shadows with an hour of chilling tales. These stories are designed to unsettle your mind and awaken your imagination as you drift into sleep. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new tale of terror. Your support helps us continue bringing you the darkest stories, perfect for your late-night listening. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and let the darkness consume you. This is your time to escape into the unknown. Let the stories begin. Be careful where you camp out in Australia. I've been pretty much all around Australia. Take my word for it, the best way to see this country is by car. There's just so many little hidden secrets and pockets of paradise you miss if you try to do it all by bus or train, or simply jetting between the major cities. My memories of road tripping Australia are for the most part positive. Sure, there have been some ups and downs along the way, but that's life, isn't it? You just keep pushing forward. And that's what I did. There's one notable stopover that still stands out though, an event which very nearly convinced me to pack in my adventurous spirit for good. I'll recount this as best I can. It was sometime around late September, a few years ago now, and I was headed from Barrage Bay up to Narooma. It's a gorgeous coastal drive for the most part, aside from a little detour inland as you pass Wallaga Lake. The best part of road tripping is the impulsivity, especially when you're driving a fully equipped camper van like me. You can pull in just about anywhere for a break, as long as the area you're pulling up at isn't illegal for camping and whatnot. And so I did, as I came around the bending roads of that beautiful lakeside drive. I found a picture-perfect spot to camp out for the night. Remote, peaceful, just the way I liked it. I set up my camp, got a hot pot of coffee going, and kicked back in the deck chair, soaking up the sun. I got there right on sunset, so it was absolutely ideal. September can be a little warmer, but in the early mornings and creeping into the evenings that time of year, you won't find better weather down under. I was gazing out over those crystal-clear blue waters when I heard someone speak, Ungwar Anani. Needless to say, this startled me. There was no one around. Well, there certainly hadn't been a moment ago anyway. Ungwar Anani. Again, that same voice. That's when I realized there was no one around. I was hearing the voice in my head. Bloody hell, I must be out of it, I thought. It had been a long drive. Ungwar Anani. Louder this time, and sending shockwaves through my head. Every time it spoke out, it was like the kick of a bass drum reverberating from the inside out of my brain. It hurt, and this is when shit got real bizarre. 3 kids came tearing out from the bush, breaking the tree line right behind my camper. They were shouting at me and pointing to the road, screaming, "Go, go, leave now!" These kids were clearly indigenous. Don't get the wrong idea. I don't mean some stereotypical image of indigenous Australian tribes living deep in the bush. They were just some local kids from a nearby camp. They sure seemed to know something I didn't, though. And it didn't sound good. I decided I'd best heed their advice. This, coupled with that weird voice, was giving me a bad feeling. I packed up my stuff and scrambled back inside my camper. I strapped into the driver's seat, turned the engine over, and flicked on the high beams. As I did so, the yellow beams of light shot straight into the dark bushland ahead and illuminated something massive. It was huge. I shit you not, 12 feet at the bare minimum. It had an almost spider-like appearance. Its arms and legs stuck straight out to the sides. Its face was pale white. I'm sure you're familiar with the Slender Man, right? The face on this thing was like him, but with a nasty scowl, his eyes beady and shimmering red. And its body, it was just like this shadowy, globby mass. In my head, the same voice from before, but it said nothing, just a low growl. The kids started bashing and kicking my camper now, but not like they meant me harm or anything. Like they were urging me to leave. They screamed something out at me, a word I'll never forget. Doolagal, Doolagal, they shouted over and over. Again, that voice from before, but much louder this time, echoed through my head. Ungwar Anani. I watched as this thing slowly, yet deliberately, pivoted on its right foot and then began walking sideways towards my car. No, really, it just kind of toppled from one stumpy leg to the other, blundering sideways toward my van. All the while, That pale white face was fixed on me, its angry expression contorting further and further as it got closer. That was it. I was out. I stepped on the pedal and floored it down the highway. As I sped off, I caught glimpses of this abomination in my rearview mirror, wobbling sideways, step by step down the highway, following my car. Thankfully, it did not appear capable of picking up the kind of speed necessary to close the gap, and I watched as it slowly disappeared into the darkness of the night. That was my first and last time ever witnessing anything in my travels I would call otherworldly. I didn't need to look very far for answers as to what I bore witness to that dark September night. A simple search for a single word those kids shouted at me would turn up everything I needed to know. Doolagall. Straight out of Wikipedia, the doolagall is a large spider-like creature of Aboriginal dreamings. It is said to have bright red eyes, and it stalks Mount Gulaga. It is said that on dark nights, one might catch a glimpse of him walking sideways across the plains. Where I was camped was a straight shot south from Mount Gulaga. So, it fits. Why this thing was down by the lakeside when it's said to stalk the mountain, I don't know. Maybe he sees all this land surrounding the mountain as his territory. Maybe he was on the hunt. I don't know. This search did lead me to look into another phrase I heard that night. Those words which reverberated inside my mind over and over. This is of the Gunyandi language, and it loosely translates into please, go. What I can't figure out is whether this voice in my head was the doolagall or something else. A protector spirit, perhaps. This doolagall thing, it did not appear to have my best interests in mind. No, more than that, everything about its demeanor that night looked as though it meant me harm. The actions of the kids, too. They were frantically urging me to get out, like they knew if I stayed there, something bad was going to happen. If it weren't for them, maybe it would have. But nah, I don't reckon it was that doolagall talking to me that night. He would have been quite happy to sneak right up on me. Still to this day, I can't shake the image of that awkward, sideways walk as he lumbered out from those trees. My dad would tell us the monsters under our beds were real. My father was a deeply terrifying human being when growing up. He never hit us, but he went out of his way to scare us into compliance. Not by using threats, but by doing strange things like hiding under our bed, making noises at night, and then telling us that it was the monster that ate children who wouldn't go to sleep. I had an older brother who had a habit of sneaking downstairs at night for food, which would make my dad furious. The entrance to our attic was right outside our bedroom door, and one night, my dad took the wooden cover off and placed a terrifying Halloween mask looking down into the hall and told us it was the attic demon waiting to grab our souls if we dared to walk past it at night. I had to hand it to my dad because it bloody worked, and my brother would be too terrified to even open the bedroom door at night. By the time I was in my teens, I think the worst thing he ever told us was that if we ever tried to sneak out at night, the monsters that lived in the house would be so angry they would kill him and our mother, and we would come back to find them hanging dead from the tree in our backyard. All I knew was fear at night growing up, and I think it had impacted me as an adult. I hate sleeping so much that if I could live my life without it, I would. My sleep troubles got worse when my dad died, and I moved back home to be a presence in the house for my mother. I'd often tried talking to my mother about the tricks Dad played on us as kids, but I suspected the mind games my dad played on my mom were a lot worse. When he died, she never really shed tears for him, and she almost looked relieved when he was lowered into the ground during his funeral. All she would say was that the stories he told us growing up became his nightmare, and if you say something enough, it becomes a reality you can't escape from. I had lived out of state and didn't have much contact with the family. The circumstances around my dad's death were unexpected. He hung himself from the tree he told us he would be found hanging from if we tried to sneak out. I had been back to sleeping in the room I shared with my brother as a kid. The anxiety started the same night I began hearing noises under the bed. It brought back memories of the noises my dad would make when he hid there, trying to scare us. This went on for weeks, and every time I began to drift off. I didn't give it much thought, and believed it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then one night, the noises turned to whispers, like someone under my bed whispering to themselves. My anxiety then turned to paralyzing fear when I heard the name Buster creep from the darkness of the room. It was a name I hadn't been called since I last saw my father. It was the nickname my dad would call me when he wasn't trying to terrify me. I lay there too frozen to move as the whispers turned to a loud taunt. "Buster, Buster, it's me, Buster!" As the taunting continued, I pulled myself together enough to plant my feet on the bedroom floor. I inched down slowly to look under the bed when I suddenly heard my dad's voice permeate from under the bed. "Remember what will happen to you if you move from the bed." Suddenly, a deathly cold hand grabbed me by my ankle, and I let out a blood-curdling scream. I felt like that same scared child who would lie in bed every night praying the monsters wouldn't get. I screamed until the lights of my bedroom suddenly switched on, and my mother was standing in the doorway of my bedroom looking at me as if I had gone crazy. Maybe I am crazy, I thought to myself the following night, as I tried once again to get some sleep. As I lay there, the thought of the cold hand grabbing my leg plagued my mind. As the familiar feeling of dread crept up my spine, a different sound caught my attention. This time it came from above, like something being dragged along the floor in the attic. I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth across the ceiling. It was then I remembered what my dad would tell my brother about demons in the attic. As an adult, it wouldn't be something to think twice about, but the fear that now gripped my soul had me doubting everything. I decided to go check the attic door outside my room. I prayed to God that the wooden cover was still in place, but to my horror, the attic was wide open. My heart was racing as I peered into the darkness. The pitch blackness of the attic was playing tricks on my mind as it morphed into grotesque shapes. Suddenly, a pair of glowing red eyes peered out from the darkness. Maybe my dad never got rid of that terrible Halloween mask, I thought to myself, as I grabbed a chair from my room. As I pulled myself into the dark abyss of the attic, I felt something brush past me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see a figure huddled in the corner. For a moment, I thought it was the darkness playing tricks on me, until the sound of crying jolted me back to reality. The crying got louder as I got closer, and as my eyes adjusted more to the darkness, my heart began to race as the figure in the corner looked like my father. "Dad, Dad, is that you?" I reluctantly called out. I couldn't believe what I was saying. As I got closer, the crying got louder. I began to shake uncontrollably as I reached out my hand to touch whoever was crying in the corner. Suddenly, my fear turned to a strange relief when my brother turned to me with red, tearful eyes. "What the hell are you doing up here, Mike? This is weird even for you." Mike had a confused look on his face. He looked around the attic as if seeing it for the first time. I was having a terrible dream about Dad. I was even more confused as my brother lives about 5 miles from the house and rarely visits. Mike looked at me again as he began to come around to his senses. He seemed even more confused than me. How did I get here? The last thing I remember was lying in bed thinking about how Dad died. After everything had calmed down, we sat at the kitchen table reminiscing about our childhood. We talked about all the terrible things Dad did to us as kids, trying to make sense of everything. Do you think it's strange how Dad died? I mean, why did he want to kill himself? None of it made sense to me either. Although my dad was strange, he never seemed sad enough to want to kill himself. When he wasn't trying to scare us into compliance, he wasn't the worst dad. I mean, there were a few good moments, a few good memories. As we continued to talk, our mom came into the kitchen. She looked glad to see her 2 boys sitting at the table like we did when we were kids. "My 2 wonderful boys," she said as she draped her arms over our shoulders. Mike looked at our mom as if she would have all the answers. "What was Dad doing by the tree that night, Mom?" I could feel my mom's body tense up as the words left my brother's mouth. "Some things aren't worth dwelling on. Your father was a complicated man. The past is the past, and that is where we're going to leave it." My mother was always great at sidestepping the truth. Emotions were not her strong point, but I suspect it was a defense she had built up to deal with my dad. When I was younger, I remember walking into the living room and my dad was waving a gun about, while my mom begged him to stop. I remember the fear in her face. Maybe I was too young to realize what was happening, but now I'm beginning to think she had it a lot worse. A few days had passed, and my anxiety seemed to be getting worse. Sleeping seemed like an impossibility. The thoughts of it filled me with unbearable dread. My heart was beating to the sound of the ticking clock on the wall when suddenly the sound under my bed returned. The scratching and knocking came in turns, like it was trying to get my attention. I put it down to my mind still playing tricks. I needed to see for myself that I was just imagining it. As I bent down to look under my bed, I heard my father's voice again. This time, it was loud and clear. "Buster, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to leave your mother." As my dad's voice rang in my ear, I peered under the bed. I didn't know what to believe when I saw my dad staring back at me. His face was all twisted. My body went numb with fear as he reached out to me. "Buster," he called out again as he tried to crawl towards me. "Look out the window. Save me, Buster." I jumped up on the bed as my dad's face came within inches of mine. I looked out the window to the lonely oak tree that sat in the center of the back garden. A different kind of fear gripped my body as I watched my mother placing a noose around her neck. I screamed and banged on the window to get her attention. She looked at me with a sort of relief on her face, like all the pain she had felt was going to come to an end. My brain was swirling as I ran to the garden. I grabbed her legs as I pleaded with her not to die. Her face was already blue as I looked for something to cut her down. I fumbled about in a panic for what felt like hours. I tried everything to save her, but eventually it was too late. Later that night, after the cops and paramedics were finished with their inquiries, I sat alone in my mom's bedroom, contemplating how everything had gone so wrong. What will I tell Mike? I thought to myself before spotting a note on the dresser. The note was made out to myself and Mike. I could barely read what was written on it through the tears in my eyes. To my beautiful boys, I tried my best to protect you growing up. I tried to shield you from the scary nightmares your father tried to fill your head with, and I feel like I failed you. When he wasn't dreaming up monsters to scare you, he was dreaming up demons to scare me. He held me captive through fear of being left to bring you boys up alone. He used the threat of suicide to keep me trapped. The night he died, I called his bluff and gave him the final push. He begged me to save him, but I turned my back until he was gone. I wish everything could have been different, but now we are all free. It all made sense to me now. This is something real that happened to me when I was younger. This happened to me a long time ago. I still freak out about small things if they bring memories about it. I'm posting here today as a coping mechanism to see if telling people about it and talking will help. I've already been to therapy, but it didn't help too much. So this happened around 20 years ago. I don't exact time. I was a lot younger. I still lived in my parents' house. I was alone as both my parents worked then. I was upstairs in my room. I don't remember what I was doing. But while I was there, every now and then a knocking noise would come from the wall behind me. When it first happened, I got up to check where the noise was coming from. I couldn't find anything, so I went back to my room. While I was out of my room, that noise had stopped, but as soon as I re-entered my room, it started again. This time, I chose to ignore it, but over time it got increasingly creepy and annoying. They were louder than before. So I checked the entire house, every room, every corner. Nothing. I headed back to my room, and what I saw nearly gave me a heart attack. A man. The tallest man I'd ever seen. He wore a black hoodie, black trousers, and black shoes. He also wore a mask. It looked like a cheap Halloween mask. When I saw him, I ran. I noticed as I turned to run, he held something. I could make out what it was. A knife? A gun? I don't know. I ran to my parents' room and quickly looked under the bed. I knew my dad kept a pistol there. I grabbed it and hid behind the bed, pointing the pistol at the closed door. I hid there for around 5 minutes, and then I felt a tap on my left shoulder. I jumped immediately on the bed and turned around. It was the worst feeling I had ever felt. Like I was about to die because my heart was coming out of my chest. When I had turned around to look, no one was there. I looked around. The door was open. Why was it open? I didn't hear anything. I panicked and got desperate. I ran to my room with the gun in my hands. They were shaking so bad that even if I tried to shoot, I wouldn't have hit anything. When I entered my room, no one was there. I grabbed my phone, sat in the corner. Phone in one hand, gun in the other. I called the police over to my house. The door to my room was open as I ran in earlier and didn't think to close the door. As I was sat in the corner, the door closed, slammed shut. I screamed, "What do you want?" "And I have a gun. Don't come in here." My bedroom had a boiler in it. I was sat in the corner where the boiler was, back against the door. The door starts to open. I turn and point the gun at the door. Another man came out of the door, shorter and slimmer than the last one. Actually, he looked unnaturally skinny. He had no mask, unlike the last guy, but I think I would have preferred he did. He had a smile that looked like it went across his entire face. I ran as fast as I could, down the stairs and out the front door. As I was running, I heard police sirens. I ran out the front door, which was open for some reason. Might be how they got in. I was out in my front yard waving and screaming at the police cars. When they got here, one started to ask me some questions while the others searched my house. I had already described the basic situation to the operator, so the officers searched my house but didn't find anyone. But in my room, the window that wasn't able to open was smashed, and the wall has a smiley face carved into it. This sadly wasn't the last time I saw those two, but I'll post my next encounter with them some other time. Real story. Creepy man in my aunt's basement. I was just turning 13 and was doing great in school, getting great grades in every class. I had some sort of beef with my brother, and it was ongoing over and over again. It got to the point where my aunt offered to take me to her house and stay for the weekend. I was fine with that, because she had one of those rich people houses in a nice neighborhood. I just got there and started downloading Warzone 1 to play with my friends on. I started playing and got dinner with my aunt, then relaxed and started to get ready for bed. I played my last match of Warzone, then went to bed watching videos on my phone until I fell asleep. All of a sudden, I heard a thud deep in the basement that echoed through the house. My aunt and uncle were still asleep, and they didn't hear it, so I just shrugged it off and thought it was nothing. Then it happened again, and I was getting really shaken up by it, so I put my slides on and decided to check the basement. There were two creepy spots down there. One was under the stairs, which went a little far down but not too far. The other was a storage room where you stored your canned foods and stuff like that. It had a weird turn that went back really far that always creeped me out. Anyways, I was down the stairs and looked under the stairs at the bottom. Nothing was there, so I looked around the basement, then suddenly I saw it. It was a black silhouette, which was about my size, 5'4". It was just standing in the corner. I was really creeped out, but thought it was something paranormal because I watched a lot of ghost adventures. I booked it upstairs into my room and didn't hear the noise again. I brought it up in the morning to my aunt, and she said it was probably just my eyes playing tricks on me. I said maybe you're right and started to get back on Warzone with my friends. I stayed up late playing while my aunt and uncle were asleep. Then I heard it again. I told my friends I have to check something out and left the room. I was contemplating going down there, but it was super tempting to catch a ghost. I was dumb back then. I went and checked everything and didn't see anything until there was one last place to check. It was the food storage room that I had mentioned earlier. I went a little ways down and didn't check the corner because I didn't think anything was there, and turned around, but then something happened. I felt hands on my shoulders, and then a whisper that said hello in a creepy voice. I turned around, and it was the same guy from last night. I had been in a lot of school fights and won all of them, so he didn't intimidate me much. I pushed him, then punched him, and then took a run upstairs and barged in my aunt's room and told her to call the cops. I put a shelf on my way back down with my uncle in front of the basement door so the intruder couldn't get out easily. He broke a window down there and struggled to get out. The police made it before he crawled out and arrested him. I later found out he had a knife from the kitchen in his pocket. I was scared to ever go back to her house ever again, and haven't been there since. I am 17 now, but still haunts me to this day what could have happened if I didn't fight back, or even check the basement. This is up there for one of the eeriest, most inexplicable things that has ever happened to me or anyone I know. I decided to tell this story tonight because it is now 12:38 a.m. on December 8th, and it would have been my dad's birthday. I was one of his best friends. My parents divorced when I was 15, and he had met Laura a few months later. My dad was an alcoholic, but not the worst I've ever seen. When I was 19, I moved about 45 minutes away to attend college, so I wasn't living with him and his girlfriend anymore. My dad called me late one afternoon, a week before Christmas, and said, "Laura's leaving me. She's packing her shit right now. Can you come get me? I don't want to fucking be here." I drove there immediately. When I walked in that door, for the first and only time, my dad hugged me and sobbed on my shoulder like he was the child and I was the adult. I would wager that is one of the saddest and scariest moments of my life. Eventually, I convinced him to come and spend the night at my place. We had driven maybe 2 minutes through town when he told me to stop at the liquor store. I reluctantly did. When he came back to the car, he sighed, almost sounding defeated. "Take me back." I refuted. "No, just come with me. You don't really need to be there right now. It's gonna be okay. Why do you want to go back?" "Nah, just take me back," he shakes his head. "No, you're coming with me. Fuck her. I'll roll a big joint you can sleep on." "Take me back," he growled. I sighed, and against my intuition I did. On the way back to his place, I played him the song "Overcome" by the band Live. The lyrics say, "Holy water in my lungs." We both cried. I called him twice a day, every day for 3 days. He was extremely depressed. I asked him what he was eating, and he said beer and Campbell's soup. That third night, he was slurring his words on the phone. Told me he had gone to the bar and fallen on the way home, but was okay, just pain on his left side. The next morning, my flip phone rings around 6 a.m. It was my dad. I whispered groggily, "Dad? Britt, I'm coughing up blood." I sat up quickly. "You what? Coughing blood?" A coughing fit on the other end ensues. "Can you come and take me to my family, doctor?" I asked him a few more questions, and against his wishes, I called him an ambulance. Later that day, I went to the hospital. When I walked past his curtain in Emerge, he was sitting on the edge of his bed. I recall thinking he looked like a cancer patient. "Oh, God, what's going on?" "They said I have pneumonia. My left lung's full of fluid," he said, and then he hung his head sadly. He was there for 5 days. They gave him Ativan and other things to help with withdrawals. I was there every day after school. He tried so hard to leave the hospital. I had to stop him from taking out the butterfly, IV, and messing with the monitors. I told him when he gets out, he can come home with me and everything will be fine. He became increasingly angry with me this particular day. This time I was so frustrated with him, I turned to leave without a hug. My BF at the time stopped me outside the door. "You should give your old man a hug," he whispered. I turned around and gave my dad an awkward hug in his wheelchair and left. I'm a very sound sleeper. Once I'm asleep, I never wake up. That night at 3:24 a.m., I jolted awake and sat up on my elbow, panting and sweating seemingly for no reason. Looked at the clock, noted it, and just went back to sleep. I was again jolted awake around 7 a.m. by my ex-boyfriend. The cops were at our door. They told me to have a seat on my couch, asked who I was, asked about my dad. I answered them hesitantly, thinking my dad was in trouble for some reason. My dad had died. Doctor told us later that day that his official time of death was 3:24. I didn't realize until later. That's when I was jolted awake, the moment my dad died. Later that night, I had a weird vision-like dream. Never had a dream like this before or since. Remember the old TVs when you couldn't find a channel? Gray static? That's what the background of this was. He was standing in front of me, looking sad and softly crying. He says to me, verbatim, "Are you sad?" Confused and frustrated, I choked out, "Yeah, I'm sad." He quietly said, "It's okay, I'm sad too." I jolted awake, my face already soaked in tears and more confused than ever. To this day, I can hardly get through the last song we ever listened to together. The line, "Holy water in my lungs," gets me every time. Happy birthday, Dad. This is an old story told to me from a few years ago. I was just reminded of it a couple days back when retelling it, and I'm curious if anyone else has ever heard of this, or if it was made up by the person who told me it. I used to work at a maximum security prison where I was in charge of overseeing the production of food. Not a CO by any means, and I was able to talk to the inmates very frequently. One early morning, I was doing paperwork when one of the inmates was doing some sort of stocking, and we were talking about urban legends. This man was Native American, I think Navajo, but I could be wrong. He will be dubbed Storm for the same of this story. And Storm told me about a legend and an experience he had on his reserve about some sort of devil, a devil called Hoofy. He claims there is this handsome man with a tall white cowboy hat and boots that frequently goes into casinos. He doesn't gamble. He flirts with beautiful young women and lures them out of the casino. Once he takes these women to his home, he transforms into this tall creature with shaggy goat legs and long black hair. His beautiful face turned into a mix of a demotic horse and a wolf with piercing red eyes. He devours these women and leaves their clothing around his homestead as a memento of his killings. I laughed because it sounded like a typical monster, but Storm gets serious and then tells me that he had a close encounter with Hoofy and he barely made it out alive. Storm and his cousin lived in an Arizona reservation, on the other side of South Mountain, very close to my hometown in Estrella Mountain. One day, he and his cousin were drinking and trying to pass the time as there wasn't much to do. They decided to take a walk into the desert, just for the hell of it. Not much else to do anyways. It was about half an hour or so from sundown, so the two tread off in a direction and enjoy the scenery of the plain desert. They walk for about 15 minutes or so when they come across this abandoned church-like building. It was old and decrepit, with weak wooden structures that looked as though a stiff wind could break down the church. The two walked through the church and out the back, walking through broken pews and the floor creaking with each step. They laughed about how freaky and weird this old building was before slowly making their way out. They walk out the door and jump over a trench just past the back end of the church. The pair continued to walk and laugh when they came across something strange. Storm says that he saw a wide arrangement of shoes, muddied red high heels, black flats, torn brown pumps, an assortment of women's shoes scattered around them that were broken and dirty, clearly abandoned for some time. Storm picked up a shoe to inspect it when he turned to his cousin. The look on his cousin's face was that of complete and utter horror. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, close to tearing, and he was looking behind Storm. Storm was about to turn around when his cousin stopped him. "No," he whispers, placing his hands on Storm's shoulder. "Don't look up. Keep your head down, man." Frightened, Storm follows his cousin's words. He had never seen his cousin so freaked out. Then he heard it, a pair of heavy footsteps walking behind him. The sound of labored breathing matching with the steps, and Storm feels as though his whole body felt 10 degrees colder. His shoulders were shaking when his cousin pulled his hand and stepped back slowly. "We need to go." His voice was nearly lost in the heavy steps behind him, but Storm heard him just barely. "Whatever you do, don't look back," was the last thing his cousin told him before he booked it. The pair ran as fast as they could, sprinting past the old church and running to their homestead. His cousin yelled out native prayers in hopes that some sort of ancestral guardian could stop this beast. All the while, Storm could hear the galloping of hooves behind them, the feeling of the creature's breathing against the back of his neck. Hot and sticky breath, smelling of rotten flesh, motivating him to keep running, no matter how tired he got. For he knew he would be his creature's next meal if he slowed down one bit. They ran, cutting the time back to their home in half. They safely make it back inside their home just as the sun was setting, bathing their home in a warm orange glow. Panting against the wall, Storm placed a hand over his fast-beating heart. Scared of what he might see, but he had to know, Storm stumbled to an outside window and pulled back a blind, peering out into the dusking landscape. In the direction that they came from, Storm could see the back of the creature walking away. 8 foot tall, being with long, silky black hair that reached its waist. Where human legs should be, instead was a pair of long goat-like legs with black stamping hooves that kicked up dust as it walked away. This happened over a decade ago when I was 12 years old. I live in a small town in Oklahoma, and in my neighborhood the houses are fairly spread apart, separated by woods. It was a school day, so my grandma picked me up from school and brought me home. This was the first year that I got dropped off at my house alone. Before this, I would just go to my grandma's house after school. I would get dropped off at around 3 p.m., and my parents would be home around 4:30. Not that big of a deal. Today, for some reason, my dad wasn't going to be home until later, around 7, and my mom, a teacher, wouldn't be home until around 8 p.m. because she had parent-teacher conferences at the school. This happened in early fall, so it wouldn't even be dark until like 8:30 p.m. I did what I usually did when I got home. I ran upstairs, got on my Xbox 360, and played Minecraft with my friends. Today, it was just me and my friend Seth. I was playing for about 2 hours when I heard a car door shut in my driveway. No one should have been here until like 7 p.m. My house is set up to where my upstairs has windows that look over my driveway. So with my mic on and controller in hand, I went to the window to see who it was. Maybe my dad got home earlier than expected. I looked outside. It was a red truck. No one I know drives a red truck. The person pulled into the middle of my driveway sideways, like he owned the place. When I looked out the window, I saw a man with a hat, wearing a big camo hoodie and jeans. It was September, so no one should have been wearing a big hoodie and jeans in Oklahoma. By the time I looked, he was already almost out of view, going up my walkway to my front door. I thought maybe it was one of my dad's friends, or someone my dad hired to do something. But he would usually tell me if someone was going to be coming over. Soon after, I hear a knock at the door, then another. I go to my other window that has a better view of the walkway up to my front door. I see the guy walking back down the walkway. I switch and go back to looking through the windows overlooking my driveway. I'm relaying all of this to Seth, still with my mic on. I tell Seth that he's walking back to his truck now. Instead, he walks past his truck and tries to open my garage side door. At this point, my heart sinks. I tell Seth that this guy just tried to get into my house. Mind you, it is literally broad day at like 5 p.m. Luckily, it was locked because sometimes we forget to lock it. After he tried the door, he starts walking to my back patio. I drop my headset and I quietly run downstairs to see what he is doing. I get downstairs and stand behind the wall so I'm not visible from the back door living room windows. I just listen. I hear him try to open the door. Then I hear a thud. It sounded like he dropped a brick on the ground or something. At this point, I'm more scared than I've ever been. I wanted to call my parents or grandma, but I didn't have a cell phone yet. The only phone in the house was in my kitchen. I would have to cross my living room to get there, and he would be able to see me if I went into there. A few seconds after the thud, I peeked around the corner and he was gone. I run back upstairs and put my headset back on, telling Seth that he just tried to open the back door as well. As I'm telling him this, I hear a car door shut. This time when I look out the window, he finally got in his truck. I looked at the truck closer, and I noticed the only thing he has in his truck bed was a crowbar and shovel. He sat in his truck for what felt like a few minutes. During this time, Seth told me to get my iPod and take a picture of his license plate. He was parked to where I couldn't see it. Then he drove backwards out of my driveway and down the road. A few minutes after he was confirmed gone, I went downstairs to see what the thud could have been. I get to the back door and see that the doormat was moved. Both big plant pots had been moved as well. He was looking for a key. Holy fuck. We have a hidden key back there too. The key to the back door was under one of the smaller plant pots on a ledge near the door, not the bigger ones that he had checked under. I went to the front porch and all the pots looked like they had been moved too. I don't know what I would have done if he was able to find the key, or if he just broke in. After he left, I called my dad and told him what happened. When my dad got home, he had a cop come over, and I told him what happened and gave him a description. The guy never came back. In around 2018-2019, 25F, at the time was 1819, was living in Nebraska, where I grew up. I lived in the largest city in NE, but it was still essentially surrounded by corn and wheat fields. The city was expanding, so rich folks started building huge houses with giant properties on the edge of town as things proceeded to grow. All of that being said, I had a good friend whose parents' house was one of those big ones, right on the blurring line between the fields and the city. My friends and I were constantly hanging out at his place because it was fun. They had tons of property to ride 4x4s on, a hot tub, a huge living room for us to watch sports and have reality TV binge sessions, etc. Plus, his parents were super cool, and we could drink out there as long as we stayed at the house. It was tons of fun, even though I am quite scared of the dark, so I would just not go outside after a certain time because there was little lighting and the nearest neighbor was about a mile away. I always felt a weird energy driving to from his place if it was late at night, but never had anything happen until one night. The drive out there was a long, winding two-way road that had thick trees on both sides, and you pass one of the city's largest cemeteries on the way. Barely any lighting, of course, besides the street lamps every once in a while, and very little traffic. It's all inherently a bit creepy, and I'll admit to having sped through this section of road many times to get through it as quickly as possible. This specific night was perfect spring weather, so I was driving with my windows down, listening to music, and it was around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves in the road when I had to essentially slam my brakes on. Right in front of me, in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards away, was what looked like a family. Again, picture a completely pitch-black road with thick forest on both sides and only my headlights to show what's in front of me. This was a family of 3, 4, a tall, slim woman, an average height weight man, a child, short hair but couldn't tell the gender based on the clothing and couldn't see their face, maybe around 8 years old, and the mother was pushing a fucking stroller. Their clothes looked normal, not tattered but not nice. They also were not carrying any kind of light source, meaning before I arrived behind them in my car, they had been walking in the pitch black. They were all facing away from me, walking completely silent in the middle of the street, the same direction I was heading. I had turned my music down to hear if they were speaking, had music playing, etc. They didn't. The hairs on my arms immediately stood up. I came to a stop in the road behind them, obviously, and just sat there for a moment to let them move. They seemed to be completely unaffected by me and didn't even turn their heads slightly, nor did they attempt to move out of my way. I literally thought I was going insane or that I was dreaming. It was so surreal. Before I really had time to fully process and register what I was seeing and how truly strange it was, they all, at the same time, stopped walking and very slowly turned to face my car. This scared the absolute shit out of me. I honestly didn't even give myself enough time to look at their faces as they turned. I immediately threw my car in reverse and sent it backwards for probably a full 20 seconds before flipping a U-turn, nearly running myself off the road and booking it the other direction. The only thing I remember noticing is that the stroller looked to be completely empty. This was the part that sticks in my mind the most. I've never felt terror like that in my life. I checked my rearview mirror probably 1,000 times before getting to a main road and never saw a glimpse of them. In fact, I never saw a glimpse of them ever again. I tried asking my friend and his family about it, only to essentially feel like I was insane because of the way they looked at me. Every time I tell this story, I get one of 3 reactions. They immediately think I'm fucking cuckoo, think I'm lying, or I've had something sort of similar happen to them. I really don't care if no one believes me, honestly. It was, and still is, the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I think about it all the time. It was either some weird-ass family trying to scare the shit out of someone, a distraction for an attempted robbery, assault, etc., or it was something more sinister. I'm going to tell myself for probably the rest of my life that it was the first option. Still creeps me out every time I think of it. Spooky. A few years ago, fall, early winter of 2019, we were staying with my husband's father. We moved into a house a couple of months later, but had been staying there less than a week at the time this happened. I slept in the living room on an air mattress with our kids, ages 10, 5, and 1. The kitchen, dining room, and living room were all open space. There was a wide counter and sink that was a bar on the living room side. He never had stools or used it like that, though. Always had a sofa pushed right up to it and had storage for dishes and whatever in the kitchen side. On each end of that counter, there was about 4 or 5 feet of open space between it and the wall. Along the wall, directly opposite the front door, were 3 doors: father-in-law's bedroom, bathroom, spare room, from left to right. My husband slept on the tiny spare bed. His dad kept the door to his room closed and usually had a TV and, depending on the weather, either a space heater, window AC unit, or at least one fan going. I don't remember if my husband had the door to the room he was sleeping in open or closed that night. Except for that back wall, where the bedrooms and bathroom were, the house had windows all the way around it. Large, floor-to-ceiling windows along the front and a line of large sliding windows along each side wall. It was originally built as a sort of camp getaway cabin. Windows equal view. Apparently, he disagreed and was in the process of building a front porch and replacing about half of those windows with wall. However, at the time, the porch was still being built and none of the windows had been changed or taken out yet. This particular night, I was holding my 18-month-old with a child on each side of us. We had all been asleep for a while when I woke up. I'm not sure what time it was, but the house was mostly quiet and no one else was awake. I lay there, quietly, without moving around, for a little while and couldn't figure out why I was awake at all, much less so alert. Not long after, I decided it was just one of those things, sleep cycles. Blah, blah, blah. And was about to try to go back to sleep, someone knocked on the front door. Not a loud, banging, beating knock, but definitely a knock. The air mattress was in the middle of the living room area, and the door was on the kitchen side of that dividing counter. I really didn't want to answer the door for multiple reasons. Was in the middle of 3 sleeping children. It was late, it was cold, and we were cozy and warm all snuggled together. It wasn't my house company, and no one else seemed to notice someone was knocking. The knocking went on for longer than I would have knocked on someone's door in the middle of the night, and did get more persistent, though never did turn into banging. No one called out for somebody to answer the door, and no one's cell rang. Finally, I heard someone walking down the unfinished porch. They had stacked some boards and tools and stuff against the front of the house. I heard no clatters or thumps or anything like that, but it did sound like whoever was out there was having to walk on and around those building materials. And then I heard a distinct and firm tapping on the window closest to the kids and me. There was a small, older TV and a small stereo/speakers sitting on 2 small tables, about nightstand size. Actually, the one holding the TV was an old nightstand I had given him years before, between the air mattress and the windows. I was facing away from the window, but the tapping was right there where our heads were. An entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, and the tapping was done only in the area that would have been in my direct line of sight if I hadn't been facing the other direction. I don't think I took a single breath until it stopped, and I heard footsteps walking away. And they walked across tin, all the way to the end of the porch where the driveway was. Walking across sheets of tin makes a pretty distinct sound. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone walks on tin. What I did not realize until the next morning was that the only sheets of tin out there were already in place because they had finished putting it up as a roof over the porch before stopping for the evening. Which meant that there were no sheets of tin stored against the wall/under the windows with those boards and tools and whatever else that was there. The only way for someone or something to have walked across those sheets of tin which I am certain, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I heard happening after hearing an unknown someone knock and tap for so long, it became unsettling rather than annoying. Would have been for them to jump, swing up onto the top of the house/porch from an incomplete porch floor, and then jump back down at the end. It scares me in a way nothing else ever has, and still does every single time I accidentally think about it. And that's why I'm typing this right now. And probably also why an owl chose just now to let loose the most terrifying, un-owl-like sound before transitioning into its usual eerie owl sounds. I worked as a dispatcher for a pretty small ambulance station near a fairly large city in the middle of the US. IDK how specific I can be, since this is a true story. And I'm going to tell one of the craziest stories I have from this job. We had a patient who we will call Susan. She was a dialysis patient, and one of the services we offered was to take very unwell or disabled patients to and from these dialysis appointments. She lived with her son, who we will call David. He was in his late 40s, and his mother, Susan, in her late 70s or so. Every week, like clockwork, we would have a unit bring Susan to and from her dialysis treatments 3 times a week. Everyone knew her at the station, because we had been doing this for quite some time with Susan. We were all familiar with her and her son, whether it was the crew seeing her in person and taking care of her, or speaking to her or her son on the phone frequently about the appointments as I had done. Everyone knew her. Naturally, when crews had news about her health, they would report back to keep everyone in the loop with how she was. At one point, she was not feeling well at all, but she wanted to go to her dialysis appointment, so naturally, we obliged and took her in. At this appointment, while receiving dialysis treatment, she lost consciousness and was promptly taken by our crew to the hospital. When it was time again for her dialysis appointment, we gave the hospital a call to see if she had been released and was able to go to the appointment. The hospital staff informed us that she would likely be released the following day and would be receiving that dialysis treatment in the hospital. Then the next treatment time rolled around, and we called the hospital, and we were told she had been released from their care the other day. This was great news, but a little strange due to the fact that we were always her first call to transport her to or from any hospital or appointment, and we hadn't transported her anywhere. We quickly moved on, however, and called David, her son, to see if she was going to be requiring us for her treatment that day. He informed us she wasn't feeling well and that she wasn't up to it, but that he was considering taking her back into the hospital. We tell him that if he needs us to just give us a call, and until further notice, we cancel her trip for the day. We never get a call. Next appointment rolls around, and we call David again to ask if she will be going. He says she's sick, and she's back in the hospital. Weird again, since we hadn't taken her, but doesn't seem that off, considering her health had been deteriorating. Next appointment, same thing happens. We call David, his mom's in the hospital, we move on. Now is where things took a bit of a turn. When the next appointment came up, we had tried calling David to ask about his mother's status, but he never answered or returned our calls. So being that we had a contract with Susan and were to take her to these appointments unless told otherwise, we sent a crew to collect her for treatment. When the crew arrived at scene, they knocked on the door to no response. They knocked again and were greeted by David smoking a cigarette. David seeming surprised, the crew said they were there to pick up Susan for her appointment. David responded, stating he had forgotten to call, but Susan was still in the hospital, not doing well. The crew gave their best wishes, and David shut the door. But the crew felt like something was off. They immediately radioed to dispatch that something was wrong, and they requested we call the hospital. David said she was to see if she was still there. The hospital had no record of her being there since we last knew. So we had the crew leave the scene, and we called for a welfare check on Susan at her son's home. We heard nothing the rest of the day from police, David, Susan, or anyone else involved. The next morning I came into work, and the very first call I took began with, "This is Sheriff," with, "I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you asked us to perform yesterday." I was nervous, as he sounded concerned, and I didn't really expect them to call us back with any news. He proceeded to let me know that upon arrival to the home, they spoke with David, who was adamant his mother didn't feel well, but that she was home from the hospital. The police asked to just check on Susan to make sure she was all right, and eventually David obliged, letting the police in. Once entering the home, they were met with a grim scene, though I imagine they smelled it first. They continued to explain that what the officers observed was the dead body of Susan propped up on the couch, wrapped in blankets, as if watching the television. But she had been dead for a while. They approximated around 2 weeks. When speaking to David, they found that he had been changing her clothes regularly and watching TV with her. Obviously, he was suffering from some sort of mental issue and grief, but the thing was, he had never taken good care of her until she was dead. No news coverage, no updates from police further than that, nothing. Stuff like this happens in your hometown, and you'll never know. Crazy, right? I was maybe 8, which would make my sister 12. My brother wasn't born yet, and I'm 9 years older than him, so had to be before then. Our parents were out for their anniversary dinner, which meant they'd be out till probably 12. My sister was very responsible and capable in babysitting me. I didn't find out till years later, but apparently my parents warned my sister that our grandma, my dad's mom, was manic depressive, which is old-timey talk for bipolar. They told her she was mad at my dad for holding some boundary with her and to not let her in or even respond to her if she came by the house. Of course, none of this was communicated to me. How could you tell an 8-year-old something like that? Anyway, a couple hours into the evening, we hear a knock on the door. My sister immediately shushes me and holds her finger over her lips. "Robbie, I know you're in there. Robbie, come open the door." I remember it like it was yesterday. I could tell it was my grandma, but I could also tell that something wasn't right. My sister moves us to the hallway, where we sit quietly out of sight of any windows. Grandma keeps pounding on the door, demanding my dad let her in. Then it goes quiet for a while. I start to relax a bit. Of course, that doesn't last. Suddenly, a bedroom window starts getting slammed, and my grandma sounds like a fucking demon screaming for my dad. I've never heard such anger since. She moves across the whole house, pounding on every window. If she wasn't so old, she would surely have broken a window with the absolute fury she was exuding. Then it goes quiet again. But now I know better than to relax. We are just huddled together in the hallway in complete silence. I'm shaking like a leaf, and so is my sister. This grandma had played games with my sister to hurt my parents in the past, such as taking her to the mall and going to the register with some jewelry, and then saying never mind, or buying the same jewelry for our cousin. Seriously, twisted shit. As I'm typing this, I'm thinking I need to talk to my therapist about it now, LMAO. So it's been quiet for a while. And out of nowhere, we hear Grandma putting on this sweet, sweet voice and directly addressing us and trying to coax us with candy to open the door. She always had a shit ton of candy around, since she was also a diabetic in serious denial. This was the most surreal experience, as she had just sounded like Satan himself, and now she sounded like a sweet old granny again. She almost got me. Thankfully, my sister was wise beyond her years and held me tightly. Finally, it's quiet for about an hour, and my sister says it's time for bed. My bedroom faced the backyard, which had a pool and a high wall, beyond which was a vast, empty field with an old railroad track through it. I was used to hearing coyotes, foxes, and other animals outside. Right as I'm winding down to fall asleep, the absolute loudest scratching on my window starts as if fucking Freddy Krueger himself was trying to haunt my dreams. I could see the silhouette of my grandma in the moonlight as it was a full moon that night. I haven't thought about this in years, and my hair is standing at full attention on my neck as I'm typing this. Holy shit. No other windows got scratched that night. Just mine. Then it was over. I woke up the next day, and my sister was telling our parents all about it. I couldn't even be in the room while it was being discussed. A few weeks later, she died from an E. coli infection. She died like Elvis, on the toilet. At her viewing, they put on one of her classic flowy blouses, and there was a breeze that lifted it up a bit, causing one of my cousins to shout, "She's alive!" and run away. After the funeral, I told my mom and dad that I was glad she was gone, and according to my mom, I said Grandma really stressed me out. She later told me no child of my age at the time should have to say their grandma stressed them out. Oh, Mom, she did more than stress me out. She terrified me more than any horror film or scary story or freaky night in the woods ever could. And I had plenty of those with my dad, who was an absolute wild mountain man. Both my parents are gone now, and I wish I would have told them about my experience that night. But I trust that my sister told them what they needed to know. Now I have a 4-year-old daughter, and my wife's parents are the complete opposite of my grandparents. Both sides of my family had seriously fucked up histories. It makes me cry when I look at pictures of her with her grandma and grandpa at their farm, riding a horse or chasing a chicken. I'm glad she gets to have the classic grandparent experience. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be talking to my therapist about this. P.S. I don't want anyone to think that I believe mental illness equals more violent. My wife and I both work in mental health, and despite my personal experiences with my psycho granny, I don't project that onto anyone else who suffers from mental illness. It manifests in so many ways, the vast majority of which are not violent. In fact, mentally ill people are far more likely to be the victims of violence than perpetrators. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadows. We hope you enjoyed this Nightmare Narratives 1-hour special. If these tales sent chills down your spine, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss a new story. Share this with someone who loves a good scare, and let us know in the comments which story kept you awake tonight. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.